I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but talking about the United States. And that means, of course, talking about the reverberations of what happens in the United States, spreading out across much of the world. The whole world has been watching these last few weeks in America. From the proximate cause, the lynching of the black man George Floyd in Minneapolis, captured on camera by a brave young camera woman who hasn't had the credit that she deserves for staying there for the full 9 minutes that the murderers killed poor George Floyd. But of course, that's just the proximate reason. The previous 12 months had seen 1,104 people in America killed by the police. Most of them, overwhelmingly actually, people of color. And that was just in the previous 12 months. If one goes back for the previous 112 years, you'll find a story in America studded with the lynching of people of color in America. And that should hardly come as a surprise. After all, the whole country was founded upon the genocide of the original American people, almost 100 million of them wiped out by white colonial invasion. And then, of course, a country built on centuries of slavery, where human beings were stolen by other human beings from their families, from their countries, shackled in chains, taken across the Atlantic, many of them never arriving, many of them ending up flecking the ocean with their blood tossed overboard, and then sold into bondage as other people's property, and their children and their grandchildren and their grandchildren, all owned as goods, as chattel by other human beings. Succeeded, of course, after the so-called freedom of the slaves in America at the end of the American Civil War, one of the worst and most brutal wars in history to that point, then leading lives of segregation, discrimination, bigotry, and not least sporadic acts of murderous violence from people who never really got used to the truth that black people were now free and as equal as them. After all, that's what it was promised in the American Declaration of Independence. No less ringing rhetoric for the fact that many of the people writing and saying it themselves owned slaves. So we'll be talking about how deeply racism is institutionalized in the United States of America and what that means for black people in the rest of the Western world. Because, of course, in Britain, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, people have risen up after the death of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd, in a way which has sometimes led to quite extreme acts of violence and acts of enormous symbolism, like the toppling into the sea of the slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol Harbour in England just a couple of weeks ago. Now, I'm joined, as always, by guests of great eminence, real wise men, 3 wise men, in fact. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. On my left is Marc Wadsworth, who is from the organization Grassroots Black Left. He's a veteran left-wing activist and journalist and was expelled by the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn on trumped-up charges of anti-Semitism. They didn't, in the end, expel him on those words, but that is what he was disciplined for. On my right, equally a veteran journalist and campaigner, Lee Jasper, a man who served at the highest level in the mayoralty of London under our old friend Ken Livingstone. And on my far right, if he'll excuse the designation, Kunle Olulode, a black film historian and director of Voice for Change. Kunle, let me start with you, if I may. It wouldn't have come as any surprise to you what happened in Minneapolis. Why do you think it sent such shockwaves across America?
I think for a different generation, the impact of those images is quite startling. And I think the additional technological advances that are at people's disposal, those images from the moment that incident happens can be beamed around the world, landed on people's mobile phones. And if you're a young person in London who probably knows a little bit about America, probably knows that there might be some tension in race relations, but seeing it graphically is a whole different ballgame. And there is no human being, I think black or white, who could not connect with what was being seen there. And people did. And I think that, the worst thing that could have happened, having had that incident happen, is that people actually did nothing. I can make many criticisms about young people today. People have described them as snowflakes. But that single moment, I think, was a catalyst for people actually really understanding something that had not been crystallized clearly in their minds.
That's why I came to you first, because it seems to me the filming of it is the X factor. Nobody filmed Medgar Evers being murdered. Nobody filmed little Emmett Till being butchered and lynched. We had to wait for Bob Dylan to write a song about it, or virtually nobody outside of his immediate circle or the immediate circles in the United States would ever have heard. But George Floyd is now everywhere precisely because it was filmed. So when they said the revolution will not be televised, they were wrong, weren't they? It's the televising that might make the revolution.
Well, I'm a big fan of Gil Scott-Heron, so I'm not going to take him up on that.
I'm a fan of his father because he played for Celtic.
I know that. I think the question is that visual media is now open to everyone. Anybody can make a film. Anybody can actually relay information visually. And that is a challenge to police forces across America, because basically people are now watching you. They've got eyes on you everywhere. So
Lee Jasper, in 1968 at the infamous Democratic Party convention, the slogan was, "The whole world is watching," as the cops laid into mainly white demonstrators outside the convention protesting the Vietnam War. The whole world really is watching now.
Absolutely, and I think that viral interconnectivity has made visceral. And I also think the trauma of the video, I had great difficulty watching it from beginning to end. I kept turning away because it was so traumatic a piece that I think the trauma of seeing somebody pleading, begging for their lives for 8 minutes, 46 seconds, with the audience of the public pleading with the officers to provide him with some assistance. And the extent to which the callous and inhumane response of the officers was to stand to attention and stand proud in watching this black man expire underneath the knee of that officer Chauvin. I think it was so resonant of the international black experience in relation to racism, not just of Africans in America, but actually Africans in Brazil, Aboriginal communities in Australia. And I think that the visceral nature of the trauma, and as Kunle says, the ability to spread that in such a quick, real-time way has given rise to the unprecedented response that we've seen throughout the world.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, because I've seen some foolish criticism, Why did she film it all? Why didn't she run to his aid? Why didn't the public around run to his rescue? The answer is because the police would have shot them.
Exactly, exactly. There's no underestimating the extent of the deadly nature of American police services. They will shoot on sight. And we've seen with the young guy jogging in the middle of Austin, Texas, just how quickly, not just the police, but white people in general will pull a gun and shoot a black person dead and not think about it for one iota of a second. So she was right to film it. She was right also not to get involved.
Marc Wadsworth, those were very powerful words just spoken there. The universal black experience. Speak to that, if you will, because if this was just an issue in Minneapolis, if it was just an issue even in the United States, we probably wouldn't be talking about it here today. Well, we might, but the audience wouldn't have been as big. It's the fact that, as Kunle put it, everyone watching it could connect to it.
Absolutely. And 17-year-old Darnella Fraser, who did the filming, a black teenager, is a hero of our time. People have been raising her name in the same breath as talking about Rosa Parks in 1955, when I was born. The fact that she had the presence of mind and the bravery to capture that moment, that lynching, is incredible. She held her nerve. Her job was to record this iconic moment for history, for all of us. And to, as a result of it appearing, that 8 minutes and 46 seconds of vicious, ruthless police brutality against an unarmed black man with a knee on his neck, lying helplessly on the ground, sent shockwaves of revulsion around the world that not only mobilized black youth from, you know, every place you can think of, in the United States, in Europe. This has galvanized a generation that themselves have suffered police brutality through stop and search. 4 times more likely to be stopped by the police in Britain than a white person. You know, my own sons, I have sons that have been brutalized in that way. You know, they start off with a neutral view about what they describe as the feds and end up hating them because they're stopped and routinely humiliated.
Let's go to America. Jonathan Jacob Moore in Oakland, California, is a podcast host and activist, describes himself as an anti-imperialist. Jonathan.
Yes.
What is your take on events witnessed in America following the killing of George Floyd?
I think that what we're seeing across the US and around the world in solidarity is a real-time reckoning with how fundamental anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence is to the holistic functioning, of our societies. From Bristol to Detroit to Los Angeles to Puerto Rico, we are witnessing a movement of people, especially young people, who are coming to terms with how police violence against Black people, economic deprivation, political disenfranchisement, these are all tethered together by a logic. And I believe that it is the normalization and the adherence to this logic of anti-Blackness, of violence, that we're witnessing people in the streets educating and organizing against. I think, we'd certainly be remiss to, not mention how the COVID crisis has not only further unveiled the kind of inner workings of capitalism for people to see up close and personal, but I think it's also created a situation where, organizing is more dangerous than normal, and physical protests are more dangerous than normal. And so that the fact that the streets are full of people across the globe should really speak to how righteous rage against this sort of founding logic of anti-Blackness is really a potent motivator. Most Black people in the US are still experiencing really bleak rates of COVID transmission in their communities, and deaths in our communities. So people are really risking a lot when they're organizing out in the streets. And I think, that speaks to how the risks that Black people in America face every day are comparable to the risks that we face organizing in a pandemic. It really is a sort of life and death situation for millions of people every day.
Is there a difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on issues of race and discrimination?
Yeah, that's a really big and great question, George. I think I'll say that as a young Black person living in America, I believe there are plenty of us who feel that something else entirely is possible, that the two-party system is a sham, that both parties are really invested in disguising that antagonism that has its roots in African slavery and Native genocide. And we're really committed to imagining an entirely different world. I think that, the fact that that question is even asked really tells us that there are no substantial differences between these parties in what they're willing to do to radically transform the relationship between Black people and violence in the United States and globally. I think that if young people saw from the Democratic Party, not just the same old policy solutions, but if people were actually open to defunding police, to getting police out of schools, then perhaps there would be something to salvage. But I don't think there's anything to be salvaged in the Democratic Party. And I think that this moment really illuminates that kind of false sense of choice that Black Americans have had, since Black people gained the right to vote.
Do you see similarities in the methodology of the American police and that of the Israeli police, some of whom have been training the Americans?
George, what is the relationship between Zionism and the genocide of Palestinians and the genocide of Black people in the US and globally? And we know that this is a long existing relationship. Not only, are American police trained in Israel, not only do American police departments have longstanding relationships and resource shares with the Israeli government, but as you mentioned, the physical tactics that IDF officers use to terrorize Palestinians are identical to the ones used here.
Powerful stuff. Kunle, let me test, though, one thing that the young man said not once but twice, anti-Blackness. I've got to tell you something. In 1984-85, I was on the front line for an entire year of the Great British Miners' Strike. All the miners were white, virtually 100% of them, and all the police were white, but they treated the miners with the kind of savage brutality that we are seeing in America against Black people. And there was no race involved. It was a challenge from the working class to the prevailing order. Never mind the ancient history. For the last 16 months in France, the yellow vests, thousands of them, every single week, have been challenging the established order in France. And as has been famously held against them, they are overwhelmingly white. Why no protests for them in England, in America? Why did nobody notice the bludgeoning, the gassing, the shooting of French protesters?
I think one of the things about politics in Britain, and perhaps even to an extent in America, is the collapse of left and right politics, which a lot of people just don't really cotton on to, which is that the issues that define the left and that define the right are not as clear as they used to be. When the yellow jackets emerged, I mean, basically, people couldn't determine whether they were left-wing or right-wing. They were still looking to hang the same old labels on them. So in terms of the dynamic, whether it was anti-establishment, anti-state, people couldn't quite place it. They couldn't quite get it. And that's why they've never been comfortable with it. It was interesting, going back to your ancient history. I too was around the miners' strike and was involved in solidarity groups, tied with Frickley Colliery, actually. And I also remember at the time when supporters went up to Frickley, and there were whole discussions about race within the miners' strike because, of course, scabs were called niggers on the actual front line. So in the heat of battle for their working lives, issues of racism, issues of sexism, all kinds of political issues got thrown up. And I think that the Yellow Jackets, similarly, because it's not something that's clear-cut, people cannot identify as readily with that. I think the question of black people, I think there's also a problematic issue around the persistence of black people being seen as victims permanently. People can identify with black people when they're being subjugated. It's quite easy for middle-class white liberals to do that. But when black people are actually standing up for themselves, it actually becomes a more complex set of relationships. And so, we may even see more empathy for George Floyd. But actually, in terms of then the consequences of that, what that means for changes in society, I think this discussion is going to get more complex as it goes on.
Lee, that is, in a way, the big question, isn't it? What will be the ongoing impact of all of this? It's quite clear, obviously, already that Trump is mobilizing a false dichotomy. It's me or anarchy. It's me or, implicitly, black people coming for your daughters. It's me and the police against a catastrophe on the streets of America of lawlessness and so on. It won't be long, in my view, before the British government and media mobilize the same narrative. So how do you avoid the content, or rather the form of the protests actually leading to a worse situation than a better one? The right, the reactionaries, being strengthened by what you do rather than weakened by it?
Well, in some senses, I think what you're witnessing actually is the death throes of Anglo-Saxon global capitalism. I think that's what you're seeing. I don't think there's any way to avoid the crisis. I think a crisis is on the way. I think global capitalism is in crisis. It becomes more hysterical. I disagree slightly with Kunle, because I think the right is in ascendancy. We can see that right across the world. Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, Trump, we could name others in Australia and so on and so forth, where the strangulation of these people on the global economy and local politics is what it is. And I think that the way that we avoid the kind of reactionary backlash is that you've got to build deep alliances around people who have got similar economic interests and so on. That requires political education. That's been abandoned. We think equality can come by some sort of managerial process of, equal opportunities or diversity or Equal Pay Act. Actually, it's got to be a fundamental restructure of the global economy.
Much more of this coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television with me, George Galloway, here in London, with my audience of distinguished experts and me being the enthusiastic amateur. We've also got people on the line all over the world who have a point of view on the subject we're discussing. How deep runs racism in the United States of America, and what does that mean for the rest of us? Let's talk with Manar Mohawish. She's in Minneapolis, exactly where George Floyd was lynched. Manar, what's your take on the events in Minneapolis where you are?
Yeah, I've been basically covering the Justice for George Floyd protest movement right here in Minneapolis, which has become the epicenter of what I would call a massive uprising that has taken over the United States and has expanded across the globe, at just the frustration that people have against police brutality, racism, and also economic inequality. I think that what this pandemic has also done has lifted the veil over the massive income inequality in this country. And so after 3 months of total lockdown and this viral video that took place here in Minneapolis that showcased Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on the throat and neck of Minneapolis citizen George Floyd, and just having him call out, I can't breathe, for over 7 minutes, and calling out for his mama, and then, you know, eventually killing him. This really triggered an entire movement seeking justice, not just for George Floyd, but around dismantling an entire system that is exploiting the masses in this country and around the world. And I bring this up about income inequality because everybody that I have talked to has said this is not just about George Floyd. This is not just about racism. This is not just about dismantling the police state. It's about dismantling an entire system that has exploited we, the people, under the pandemic, under the last 3 months. While 40 million Americans filed for unemployment, we saw the largest profit seen by white billionaires.
Is the rioting and looting that we've seen on the television representative of the protests, or is it being exaggerated?
Well, I've been on the ground in Minneapolis here at the epicenter of the George Floyd justice movement, and I've been live streaming daily what has been taking place here in Minneapolis. And the media at the very beginning was really done an unfortunate thing, which is kind of paint this with one stroke brush, that these protesters are violent, they're looters, and even President Trump went on Twitter and called the protesters thugs. And obviously the media take has kind of shifted a little bit, but that was a really unfortunate thing to see, because what we witnessed on the ground, we were just live streaming, recording what we were seeing, is that these were mass, unarmed, peaceful protests chanting just a few slogans, which were, I can't breathe, justice for George Floyd, and dismantle the police state and end the two-party system. And these people were all unarmed. None of these people were protesting with weapons. It was the police that had come out with their riot gear, with their batons, with their tear gas. And I witnessed and recorded on Mint Press News' Facebook page and Twitter page. We recorded and filmed the police shooting tear gas at protesters, shooting rubber bullets at journalists. I witnessed police shooting at drivers, rubber bullets, an entire family with children inside of them. It was a very traumatic scene to witness here in Minneapolis. And what I did see is some people going up to banks like Wells Fargo and spray painting them with that capitalism is destroying our communities. And they did target some banks, some of the protesters, but remember that the majority of the protesters were peaceful. And a lot of rumors have spread that some of these arsonists who are burning down buildings, because if you look at the building that they're burning down, they're not burning down buildings outside of South Minneapolis where the people are frustrated, or that's where they are burning down the buildings. It's buildings in Minneapolis, businesses that are run by Black owners and people of color. And so it really begs the question is, who are these arsonists? Are they actually from the community, or are they coming from outside of the community to instigate and provoke the police for more violence? And so we really have to ask these questions to know what's expanding this rioting and what's making the violence worse. Is it the people, the mass people who are unarmed, or is it the police and these outside instigators? I don't know how many times we saw footage of people showing up at protests and they were like literally bricks prepared for protesters. Who's putting out these bricks? Who are these white, young white people who are throwing things at police officers, who are provoking the police to start shooting at protesters? These are questions that we have for them.
Very powerful indeed. Manar, thank you very much for that. Kunle, she's got it right, hasn't she, in that, look, I've got to tell you, I don't want to sound like an old man. I'm not particularly. I've seen these things come and go. The Wall Street, Occupy, we've seen these spikes in radicalization, political consciousness, direct action, the riots in Seattle against the globalized capitalism and so on. I've seen them come and go, but they go up like a rocket, but they come down like a stick. In what way will this, do you think, be different, or will it?
Well, obviously, I can only look at it from the perspective of the UK. I'm not intimate with all the details of what's happening in America. But I don't think it's that you're too old, George. I don't think we've become hacks or whatever. I think there are some really important concepts that need to be grasped in terms of strategy, tactics, leadership, and principle that are lacking at the moment. And to see an organization one day call a demonstration, mobilize and energize young people to actually come out onto the streets. But when things get a bit tasty and a bit tough, you then withdraw from that. But those young people are still going out there. They're still going to protest. That's quite a dangerous situation. So I think there are some things that we look at this and say, this is great. Young people are animated, are passionate, wanting to change the world. These are the kind of things that when I was growing up, we talked about. So I think it's a tremendous thing to actually see and behold worldwide. But that has to be channeled in a constructive direction. Otherwise, you can see that if this doesn't lead to something, cynicism is not far behind in terms of being able to also influence people's outlook when things don't happen. Or, as we might see, general just frustration leads to violence, and some mindless violence at that. Nevertheless, the question of leadership, I think it becomes key. And at the moment, that's still a bit hazy.
I think that's right, Lee, don't you? In the past, black political activity was led by people like you, people like Marc, in this country. In the United States, led by Dr. King, by Malcolm X, by Jesse Jackson, and so on. Where are the leaders? Who are the leaders of this? I got a feeling we haven't seen them yet.
Well, we're about to see them, because if they weren't on the national security threat agenda, they certainly are now. And I think that what we'll see is the kind of policing response to the Black Lives Matter, that we'll see the right-wing press find out exactly who they are. They're coming for them now. And they will be the target of all sorts of covert and overt policing inquiries and strategies by the security services. But I think that, look, I'm slightly more optimistic in a sense, in my view, because both in terms of the environment, we saw the massive global response led by young people in relation to challenging environmental degradation and the polluting toxicity of capitalism in terms of the free market economy. We've now seen a response to the social pandemic of white supremacy being raised up all over the world. It's a radicalizing moment, I think, for many, particularly within the context of COVID, as was said from our first speaker from America, that COVID is having this radicalizing in effect. I think it does need some more coherence. It does need some more congruence, and in relation to getting a specific agenda for real change. But I think this is their moment to get there. There are some elements, because of the Black Lives Matter is simply a hashtag. It's not a movement. You can't describe it as that. It is several cells of individuals coming together all over the country to do various different things. But nevertheless, I can see the potential for a coherent agenda emerging, and we've got to give those young people the support, the education, the passing on of wisdom from our generation to the next generation of leaders, so they don't make the same mistake we made and the mistakes that you've outlined. But at the same time, George, this has been around for 1,000 years, this beast, and it is terrifically resilient, and it is capable of commodifying the revolution. And when you see Nike and Hollywood and NFL basketball and baseball and, you know, the stock exchange bending on one knee and saying Black Lives Matter, then a question mark does arise. In fact, is this the absorption of Black Lives Matter within the accommodation of the existing status quo, and will it survive that process?
Kunle, you were shaking your head there. You disagree?
Slightly. I mean, in terms of emphasis, the one thing that's missing from this particular movement is a notion of class. And for me, the question of identity politics plays a much stronger role in terms of driving this than it has done in the past. And that takes us into different kind of territory. It means that the question of how you build unity and solidarity is much more difficult.
This is the point I was alluding to earlier, Mark. You see, if one's tactics alienate white working class people, then unity with them will not be possible. At the same time, as capitalism is opening its arms because it can absorb a cultural revolution. It's a political and economic revolution it fears. You know, Nike can take the knee to black people, but they're not going to take the knee to trade unionism. They're not going to take the knee to anti-capitalism. You see my point?
I do see your point, and I agree with that point about commodification. And it's also called, when they capture a radical moment like this and turn it into a style item, stock exchange, Nike, Bill Gates, all sorts of people that are putting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds into Black Lives Matter. It can be incorporated. But the genie is out of the bottle, George. You cannot put citizen journalism, which is what Darnella Frazier did, the 17-year-old black teenager, you can't put it back in the bottle. Social media now is taking on mainstream media, what we call in citizen journalism, big media, because it is unfiltered. It doesn't rely on gatekeepers. And so the game is up for journalists, even like me. We're not the truth tellers or the messengers anymore. The young people are doing it for themselves through Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter. That's how they're getting these flash mobilizations that Kunle talked about. Tens of thousands of people, young people, on the streets day after day. You know that in our day, 30 years ago, it took some months to put that amount of people on the streets in a big demo. And the trade union movement, the labor movement, all the liberal radical movements need to step up to the plate and join the young people and be behind them, not in front of them, trying to run it, but accepting that change is here now. It's not about one rotten apple. It's about a rotten tree, a rotten orchard. The whole way that the police force is programmed is to protect the ruling class, and that's got to change. We need a people's police force that actually are part of the demonstration. Like in Scandinavia, there's a model. They have long hair. They act more like stewards than a coercive force of the state. It's got to change, and this can't be stopped now. Even if Black Lives Matter disappear in a month or so's time, the energy that's been unleashed with the youth and the demands that they're making will last longer.
And they put more white people on the street than either you and I have ever put on the street. We put lots of white people, anti-racists, on the street to come to the point about identity politics. They have turned out more white people globally against racism than we've seen in modern times, other than the civil rights movement or the anti-apartheid movement.
I was going to make that point earlier. When in the time of Rosa Parks, in the time of Emmett Till, the only white people on the protests were white Jewish communists, something that you don't find all that often now in the United States, though God preserve their memory. But that's not the case now. Now there are actually, in many of these demonstrations, more white people than black people.
Exactly, and that's the point I make about the identity politics point. Actually, if you read Black Lives Matter manifesto, it is anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist. And they say that, both in the United States and here. Now, we might... I have issues...
It's a little bit confused, though.
Well, it's bound to be confused because it's chaotic.
It's everything from transsexual...
You're looking at two black leaders here between me and Mark, right? who have felt the full weight of the establishment for speaking about race. Can you blame young black people to say, sorry, I don't think we want any of that, so let's keep ourselves underneath the radar. Let's organise in this way. Now, it comes with its strengths and it comes with its weaknesses, just as there were strengths and weaknesses in what we did. But the irrevocable lesson of black people in this country is do not stand up because you will be chopped down. And history shows us that's exactly how it has happened. By and large.
I'm just not buying that, because the relationship between those mass white followers is actually a subservient one, which is basically one in which you listen and our experiences are what count. In terms of infusing it with a much more direct political challenge, that means actually really thinking through, what does actually unity mean? What does it actually mean in terms of going forward as a movement to challenge the establishment? People have talked about systemic racism. Systemic racism has always been there. We've always talked about it as a system, as distinct from prejudice. But when people talk about systemic racism today, are they talking about a system, or are they talking about the changes in individual behavior that they're looking to actually change rather than society? So that's the challenge, I think. And I think much of the anti-racist movement today has bought into what I call is behavioral change, not systemic change.
Let's go to America. Walter Mignolo from Durham, North Carolina, is an Argentine-American professor at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences and a professor at Duke University. Professor Walter, thanks for joining us. Do you think the movement will be sustained in the long term, or will it be a repeat of past movements and just fizzle away?
Well, that's difficult to say, but what I perceive now, that this has acquired a dimension that we didn't see in the previous 2 or 3 cases, because the participation of all ages and all colors and the demands. I think something is changing now that may encourage people not just to keep the protest for over and over for month on month, but this could be a very important moment to not let it down. So I hope that something will remain.
Thank you, Professor. Final round then, gentlemen. A question was asked earlier. Is there a difference between the Democratic Party and the Republicans? Is there a difference between Biden and Trump? Or are these two cheeks of the same backside, Tweedledee and Tweedledum? Mark, you first.
Yes, they are the same. If you look at Governor George Wallace in the Deep South, and I remember this from being a teenager, standing on that bridge, a Democratic governor, standing in the way of federal troops trying to get buses with black school children into schools in his state. I think it was Alabama, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. This was a Democrat. And there are what are called blue dog Democrats. And they're to the right of Republicans. So it's almost a geographical thing rather than a party political thing. And I think that in the same way as the political system is broken in Britain, it's broken in America. You're voting for two sides of the same coin. And there's got to be a break with that. Jesse Jackson, when he ran, do you remember, in, I think, 84, he had a real opportunity to break with the Democratic Party. He had huge support, and he didn't. Ross Perot, you'll remember him as well.
But, Kunle, this white privilege, what white privilege does an unemployed white man in Sunderland or in Newcastle or in Scotland, what white privilege have they got? And if you go around brandishing that, you're almost guaranteeing that the white man thus accused will side with Boris Johnson and Donald Trump.
Well, I think that's already there. In terms of the question of class and the relationships between black and white, you know, I grew up in a working class community in which people had nothing. It didn't matter whether you were black or white. We went to the same state schools. We hung out in the same youth clubs. But at the end of the day, there was still this thing called racism. And it's true. The chances of you actually getting employment if you're black or brown is less than that of a white person. But as you've indicated, George, I think that the degrees of alienation that white working class people also feel from this system is not taken into account. And instead of actually then challenging that anger into a constructive way, it becomes resentment. And it manifests itself as a white racist backlash. So I'm not one of the people that actually believes that the white supremacist notion is a useful concept. In fact, I think it's quite destructive. But that's, again, an indication of the weakness, the political and ideological weakness of this Black Lives Movement, because it feeds on that. Now, if you're going to actually engage in something progressive, then you have to put your cards on the table and have some serious open discussions about the differences in terms of experience and where we want to actually get to. And I don't think we're having that honest discussion yet. We're seeing a lot of celebrities who are putting their money behind Black Lives. We know that in the States, Google have bankrolled the Black Lives Matters movement by $5 million since 2016. So, you know, there are people bending over, you know, backwards to now pour money into Black Lives Matters UK. I work in the charity sector. I've got black community organizations who, during this COVID epidemic, are likely to go bust at the end of it. I do not see these celebrities and other people going to their local communities and saying, what can we do to help? How can we build things here? So even there, at that level, there's a lack of realism in terms of what this moment actually really represents. So I think people really need to think this through.
Lee, Jasper, finally, a last word to you. It's true, isn't it, that all workers are oppressed, but that black working class people are super oppressed.
Absolutely.
That's how you sum it up, isn't it?
Absolutely. We're all on the same boat, but some of us are on the top deck, the middle deck, and some of us are in the bottom deck and in the belly of the beast, as it were. So I think that's right. I think it's interesting that actually, you know, the anti-racist movement, at least for the last 20 years, has been increasingly white-led. And therefore not been making revolutionary downs in terms of that structural change. When we were leading the movement, we got the Stephen Lawrence inquiry out of it for all of its worth. When the white left captured the movement, we've had this diversity headcount. So the failure of the anti-racist movement is actually an aspect of white privilege that has come to dominate the anti-racist struggle. And instead what you're now seeing is a black young people saying, actually, to hell with that, that's not represented us. And now they're articulating a much more fundamental agenda in a way of systemic and global change. So I know there's a cynicism around the room, but each generation comes to its point, whether it's the student movements in the 68, whether it's other movements that we can cite around the world. But I think there's room for optimism here. I think there's room of optimism for building further alliances. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has shown how that is capable by putting white people on the street. The issue is, for us, is the sustainability, the resilience and the power of corporate co-option of the state. Will it survive that? That's much more of a stiffer challenge.
But it's definitely about race and class. Yeah. And you know, we knew A. Sivanandan when he formed the Institute of Race Relations, Darkus Howe, Race Today Collective. It's got to come back to that.
Yeah.
You know, the people who are dying, the black people who are dying are working class.
Yes,
right? White people are making the connection. I grew up in a white working class neighborhood
most
as well.
of the white people,
so did I.
Most of the whites involved are comfortable middle class whites. The black people on the marches have more in common in class terms with the football lads that are confronting them on the streets of London today. This is a dichotomy that's
a fundamental
dangerous.
failure of the left to deliver for the white working class,
that's my
as
point.
it has failed to deliver for the black working class.
That's why there's thousands.
But the reactionary response of the white working class is to blame black people.
Yes, but
we can't concede to we can't concede to if you concede to racism, it will consume you.
No, I'm not asking you to concede.
I'm asking you
to listen. The the alienated white working class and lumpen proletariat on the streets against Black Lives Matter actually exist in the same socioeconomic sphere as the great majority of the black people on the other side of the demonstration. The white people, on the other hand, have dropped in from Primrose Hill with their Guardian rolled up in their back pocket and 5 lattes under their belt.
But the
You
white
see my
working
point?
class have just put in Boris Johnson. I mean, to a large extent, we saw the migration of a Labour working class to an extreme right-wing agenda that is all about. I mean, look, Labour
Whose
introduced.
fault's that, though?
Labour introduced
That's
more.
Labour's fault. That's the left's fault.
That's what I just said, George. I've said it's the left's fault. I'm not disputing that at all. I'm saying it's a failure of the left in order to meet the genuine aspirations of what I'm from Manchester. We know about economic collapse. We saw the collapse of the mill economy and the working class up there way before unemployment or financial crisis hit the southeast of England and so on. So I understand the extent to which those communities are marginalised. But why then blame black people? Why then blame Muslim? Why then blame foreigners in relation to that and give expression to this racist perspective that then leads to Boris Johnson smashing it at the last election and the willful destruction of a Corbynite agenda?
He doesn't look all that comfortable now. 80-seat majority.
Be careful what you wish for, you might get it.
But I'll make a point that you know where white working class live cheek to jowl with migrants, they're more tolerant towards migrants than areas where there are no migrants.
Precisely the
so
point.
There is room for optimism and solidarity.
Yeah.
Well, look, as you can see, the argument goes on. I've been George Galloway. You've been a marvellous audience. Thanks for watching Kalima Horra.